Hey everyone, my name is David Roscoe and I am a professional wedding and commercial photographer. Today I want to talk to you guys about the basics, shutter, aperture, and ISO. What the heck do these things mean and why do you need to know them? Photography is something that is so widespread in our culture today that it is important, I think, to set yourself apart and learn the basics about these three things that are so important to photography. Whether it's you're a hobbyist and you want to take better pictures of your kids when they're out of their sports game, or you want to take better Instagram photos, or maybe you have a business and you need great photos for social media and for your website. These things and having a little bit of knowledge about these things will help you along that way. So what the heck are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO? To understand that, I'm going to use this film camera a little bit just to kind of give you a visual representation of what these things are and how a camera even makes a picture, because I think that would help you understand a little bit. A camera takes light coming through the lens and focuses that light onto either a piece of film back in the film days or a digital sensor in today's modern times. Now within that system, you have three things that are critical to getting a good picture: your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. All of these are intertwined. It's because if you make a change to one, it's going to impact the other two. Each one of these three things also has a secondary characteristic. So not only are they letting in the proper amount of light that you want, either letting in more light, letting in less light, they're also causing these secondary characteristics in your image to come out. Maybe there's more things in focus in this particular image that you're taking, or there's less things. Maybe there's some motion blur, or maybe the things are tack sharp and you've frozen this kind of super quick moment in time. These are some of the secondary characteristics that these three things, shutter, aperture, and ISO, will kind of bring out in your image. One thing to know before we dive right into this is that all cameras these days, at least most of them, have what is called a light meter inside of them. That light meter takes all of the values of light in a scene from the brightest all the way down to the darkest, and then takes an average, and it gives you a proper exposure, or what it thinks is a proper exposure. This light meter is the scale that you will see on your camera, and I'll throw up images right now, and that has 0 in the middle, and then it has -3, -2, -1, 0, +1, +2, and +3. That's helpful because if you point your camera at a scene and it is showing the little indicator at +2, then if you take the picture with those settings, then your picture is going to be 2 stops or 2 units overexposed. It's going to be 2 units brighter than what it thinks is the proper exposure. Now, the reverse side of that is if the little indicator is underneath the -3, then it's going to be 3 units darker, 3 stops underexposed than what it thinks is a proper exposure. So say you take the picture and then you look at the picture on the back of the camera and it shows that it's pretty dark. Then you need to change the settings so that way the indicator is at the 0 mark, and that is what it would think the proper exposure is. So first things first, let's start with aperture. Aperture is found in the lens. You can think of this as like the closing and the opening of your pupil. As the iris in the lens closes down, it lets in less light, but more things are in focus. As it opens up, it allows more light in, but there is a shorter plane of focus. So this is the reason that you see those photos on Instagram or wherever with a super blurry background. They have a aperture that is super wide. Aperture is measured in f-stops. So you see an F and then the numbers going next to it. From the most wide open, you'll have apertures of say f1 or f1.2, f1.8, f2, f2.8, and so on. And then as it closes down more and more, you'll have apertures of f8, f16, f22, and that is letting in less light, but there are more things in focus. So you have this spectrum of letting in lots of light, but a small depth of field, all the way to letting in less amounts of light, but having a greater depth of field. The best way to illustrate this is to just show you. So I'm gonna jump on out of here and we're going to kind of show you the real world effects of what aperture does. So we're outside and we're first going to look at the effects that aperture has on a picture. So I'm gonna have Yaz be my model and we're gonna take some pictures. I'm gonna show you the progression from super wide open all the way to closed down and the progression of what those pictures look like and how it affects your image. So let's go. I am recording in my camera and I'm just gonna run through a couple of the basic settings before we get started. So just to know, I'm shooting in RAW. You don't have to shoot in RAW. That is only if you're going to be editing your photos afterwards in Photoshop or Lightroom. Otherwise, go ahead and just use JPEG. You can see down at the bottom here. Okay, so we're gonna start at f1.2. That is the widest aperture that this lens will open up to and also lets in the most amount of light. You can also pay attention to my settings that I'm using right now. I'm 1/60th of a shutter speed, or 1/60th of a second for my shutter speed, and I'm using ISO 100. All right, so we're gonna take our first image here. 1, 2, 3, cool. Okay, so now we're gonna move up to f1.8, and you'll see that it gets darker because it's letting in less light. So I'm gonna raise up my shutter speed just a little bit. I'm gonna take another picture. Awesome. Now we're going to go up to f2, and you can see it gets a little darker again. All right, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now we're at f8, and you can probably see a huge difference between when we first started to where we're at now. When I take the picture and it plays back, you can see a lot more definition in the background. And even as I go up further to f11, I'm gonna continue raising my ISO to balance out the exposure. The background just gets less and less blurry. Let's do one more, 1, 2, 3. And then I'll do one more at like f16. 1, 2, 3. Next up is shutter speed. What the heck does that even mean? So in a camera, like I said, you have a piece of film or a sensor. And then in front of that, you have this covering of that. This is called the shutter curtain. And when you press the shutter button to take a picture, that shutter curtain opens up and it exposes the sensor to light, and then it closes back down. It does this for a certain period of time, and you get to determine what that period of time is. Shutter speeds are measured in fractions of a second all the way up to whole seconds. So you have everything from, say, 1/4000th of a second all the way to 30 seconds. Obviously, 1/4000th of a second will let in a very small amount of light compared to 30 seconds. One thing to know is that us as humans, we don't have perfectly steady hands. So knowing that we have an area of, let's say, 1/40th of a second, 1/30th of a second, where if we go lower than that, then it's going to introduce blur and shake into the image that we're taking. So if you want tack sharp images, which most people do, then you're going to want to pick shutter speeds that are above that. There is also a rule, and that says that if you have a lens, let's say my lens is a 50mm lens, then you don't want to go lower than the reciprocal of that, meaning that if I have a 50mm lens, I don't want to shoot slower than 1/50th of a second. That all being said, you can actually use this secondary characteristic of shutter speed to your advantage. So the slower that a shutter speed is, the more blur, the more motion blur that it'll introduce into an image. And the faster that a shutter speed is, the more that you will be able to freeze a fast moving object. Maybe it's a water running, maybe it's a sprinter running on a racetrack, maybe it's a car race or a jet airplane. The faster that your shutter speed is, the more that you will be able to freeze that subject. And let's go ahead and go outside and I'll show you another example of this in action. Now that we've looked at aperture, let's look at how shutter speed affects an image. I'm gonna have Yaz jump up and down, and I'm gonna shoot at various shutter speeds, and I'll include the settings, and we'll see how that affects the images as well. We're gonna start at 1/2000th of a second. This is pretty fast. And I'm gonna have Yaz jump, and we should see that it should freeze her in midair, hopefully, if I time it right. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3. I'm going to drop the shutter speed to, let's go down to 1/500th of a second. and see if that changes anything. So now this is a slower shutter speed. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, jump. Now I'm going to drop the shutter speed down to, let's go to 1/120th of a second. Now this is probably like middle of the road shutter speed. If somebody's not moving very fast, then this will probably work. Walking, this may still freeze in action, but it's kind of like getting on that borderline. So let's do one more jump. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. And this one you can see a little bit more blur in her hands, and I'm gonna drop the shutter speed even more and you'll start to see more of that. So let's go down to 1/60th, and you can see I changed my settings, my aperture and my ISO to balance out the exposure. So now we're 1/60th of a second. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, go. And now you can start to see some blur coming in the picture. Now I'm gonna drop it down even lower to, let's do 1/20th of a second. This would not be, this shutter speed I would not be able to hand hold more than likely without causing some blur in it. So, okay, ready as 1, 2, 3, go. And you can see this one is super blurry. You can't even make her out on this one. Lastly is ISO. What the heck is ISO? ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor or your piece of film to light. Back in the old days when we shot film, we had to pick film in accordance to the lighting situation that we are going to be in. Meaning that if I'm going to be out in broad daylight, I'm going to pick a film with light sensitivity that is pretty low and not super sensitive to light. The reverse of that is that if I was in a super dark situation where there's not a lot of available light, maybe it's a wedding reception, then I'm going to pick a piece of film that is more sensitive to light there, so I can get in as much light as I can possibly get in. These days with digital sensors, we can pick and choose that sensitivity on the fly, and we can change it in accordance with our situations. ISO is measured from ISO 100 all the way up to say ISO 102,400, which is pretty insane. So this being least sensitive and this end being the most sensitive to light. Now with that sensitivity also comes consequences. ISO 100 is going to be your cleanest version of an image, whereas the more that you increase ISO, the more noise and graying that you introduce into an image. So that is a result of having to amplify the amount of light that is in a situation. The more amplification that you go, the more noise and artifacts, just kind of grainy color artifacts that you'll introduce into an image. You can think of this as like turning up the volume on your car stereo. Maybe you're in your car and it's at a good volume and you can hear everything perfectly clear, right? So then as you continue to turn that up, maybe your speakers aren't the best and you turn it up and up and up to the maximum. At that maximum, the sound is being distorted and it's not coming through as clear as it normally would. So this is the same thing in terms of ISO. The more you crank up that ISO, the more distorted the image becomes. Knowing that in situations where there is a ton of light available, say for example, midday, 12 noon, the sun is right above you and there's a ton of light, it's not a cloud in the sky, you would use ISO 100. Conversely, if you're in a wedding reception and it's super dim, or maybe it's nighttime and you're trying to take some pictures inside, indoors, you're going to want to raise that ISO up so that way your sensor is more sensitive to the smaller amounts of light that is available at nighttime versus midday, right? Obviously there are exceptions to the rule, but this is just kind of general rules for right now. So again, to illustrate this, let's go ahead and jump into a real world situation and I'll kind of show you what that looks like. Typically the rule that I use is you want to choose the lowest ISO that you can in a given setting based on your circumstances. So we're outside right now, there's plenty of light outside and I want to choose ISO 100, but then we're gonna change the settings and the situation and see how that affects ISO. Okay, so now we are indoors and you're seeing what it looks like if I were to take the picture right now. That is the wonder of mirrorless camera, is that you can see the picture before you take it. But so this is ISO 100. We are indoors and it is nighttime, so it is dark in here and there's only a lamp next to Yaz right there. So I am going to slowly raise the ISO, and you can see what happens as I raise it, keeping the same settings. So ISO 100 to ISO 200. You can see her getting a little bit lighter. I'm gonna take a picture just to have. And now let's raise it up another full stop from ISO 200 to ISO 400. And now you can kind of see Yaz and make out a little bit of the scene here. Yaz with one of our dogs, Comet. And I'm gonna raise it up even more. Let's go to ISO 800. That's another stop. And we're gonna take another picture. Awesome. So let's go up to ISO 1600 now. Now you can really start to see everything. We can kind of see a little bit more of Comet. And let's go up again, ISO 3200. Now things are even starting to get too bright, I think. I would maybe consider lowering my aperture, but let's go up to ISO 6400. So this is ISO 6400 without having changed any other settings. Now we're at ISO 12,800, and now things are just totally blown out. You can see how much brighter that is. But at this point, I could raise my shutter speed if I wanted to, and even out the exposure. So I could raise it all the way from 1/80th to probably 1/320th, maybe even 1/400th. That looks good. And we could take that picture as well, so we have that for reference. Let's raise it up to ISO 25,600. So remember, as you raise ISO, you tend to go down in quality. It brings in noise, it brings in artifacts. At this point, this is the upper limit of my camera, and I really wouldn't go higher than this. I know this was a long one, and I hope that some of the information helps you and gives you a little bit of knowledge moving forward in your photographic journey and helps you become a better photographer. Cameras these days are so technologically advanced that they can do most of the work for you, but having the ability to know what is going on, know the settings that your camera is picking, will help you to override those settings when the camera makes a mistake. And it'll just help you become a better, more informed photographer in general.